begin now. I'm Jerry Garfinkel. I'm the treasurer of the Jewish Studies Center. And so I'll begin as treasurer. As treasurer, I wanted to say that all of our classes, including this one, are free. Most of the instructors are fairly knowledgeable. I'm one of them, so I'm not sure if I can speak for myself though. And we do have expenses. Well, usually expenses for Zoom, though this Zoom's actually not ours. So if you want to donate some money for us, we would appreciate. You can go to our website, www.jewishstudiescenter.org, and you can click on donate. You can donate from your PayPal account or the credit card or the check. If you check off that you want to donate by check, it'll tell you where to send the check. Okay, as you all realize, this is being recorded. And the closed captioning is on. So if you don't understand my accent, which is probably still somewhat New Yorkish, or Marsha's, you can look at the closed captions. And before I begin the actual presentation, let me thank Mary Jane Roth, who is the Vice President of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Greater Washington, Vice President for Programs. And this whole three-session class is co-sponsored by the Genealogy Society of Greater Washington and by the Jewish Studies Center. Okay, so now I usually introduce the person who introduces the program, but this time I'll introduce myself because I'm going to start the program myself. So what this is about, this session, before I go into that, the recording will be available in a day or so. And besides the recording, I'll be showing a PowerPoint, as will my cousin Marsha, and both PowerPoints will also be available to you. So don't take notes. It won't be an exam afterwards.
Okay. Jerry, I also want to ask people if they have questions to type their questions in the meeting chat, and I will take them out and we'll take questions at the end.
Yeah, put your questions and also any comments in the chat, as Mary Jane said, but address them to everybody. Because sometimes you have a question or a comment and someone else will comment upon that. So address it to everybody. At the end of the session, at the end of the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. Okay, so let me see if I can do my share screening, and I'll start with this. And I will start with, no. Okay, so I hope you all can see this first slide of mine. It basically, well, has the name, Tracing Your Jewish Roots. On the left
Jerry, did you mean to have your notes and preview slide come up on everyone's screen?
No.
You might want to back out of this and
I'll back out and
try
back
again.
up. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, you see just the slide.
That's better.
Okay, very good. Okay, so on the left side is a picture of the sort of welcome to Buchach, where my father grew up for the most part. And I took that picture when I visited Buchach in 2018. It's in Cyrillic, obviously. On the right side is a picture of the great-grandfather of both myself and my cousin Marsha. And Marsha will be talking about things. I'll explain what she'll be talking about. So it was very surprising. We actually had a picture of our great-grandfather. Okay. Let's see if I can do this. Okay. Now, oops, that's not right. Okay. The material I'll be covering is of interest to me, obviously. That's why I gathered it, and probably of interest to Marcia and other people in my family. Maybe some of it might be interesting to there are others of you. But the real reason why I want to do the presentation is that in the process of learning about my family roots, I learned a number of things, lessons learned, let's say. First of all, things that my family told me, and also things that I found in official documents were not always accurate. Second, some of the things I discovered were really very unexpected. Third, my sources, I used sort of standard genealogical sources and standard Jewish genealogical sources, but a lot of the sources I used were non-standard and, somewhat even accidental. So you saw when you take a class on how to do your genealogy, they'll give you the various sources that are available, but often there are other non-standard sources available. I discovered that. And lastly, I discovered it was very useful to me to be a member of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Greater Washington. I learned things just by being a member. So that's my lesson. As we go by, I'll be talking mainly about those things. Okay, when I was a kid, young child, here's kind of what I knew about my family. And this is not everything, because I also knew about cousins, like the children of this is my mother's siblings' children, which are my cousins. I knew them, and I knew also her cousins and their children, which are first cousins, second cousins, etc. One of the second cousins being Marcia Spector. So I knew some cousins, but these are the main people I knew from. Well, also I knew my sister Sheila, but these are people I knew, basically people in my parents' generation and my grandparents, my four grandparents. Though I didn't really know, I never met Tzvi Tovia, my father's father, because he was in Israel. But the other three I did meet. So then the question comes up: why do genealogical research? Why did I even start this process? Well, I started to find answers to questions. And the first question really was, when did my father come to the United States? I knew that he had grown up in Europe, and he came to this country, obviously, at some point, but with his mother. But when did he come? So I started looking at my father's history. Well, I knew he was born in Buchach, and his father was a rabbi, and he told us that during World War I, the whole family fled to Vienna to get away from the combat in the war. I looked it up, by the way, and World War I, beginning in August of 1914, very, very quickly spread to the area where my father grew up. So that makes a lot of sense. And after the war, his parents divorced. Unusual, but it's it happens even with rabbis and stuff. And his father and his brother went to Palestine, which eventually became Israel, and he came with his mother to America. Well, and while they were crossing Europe to get to a ship to take him to America, they used his mother's maiden name of Garfinkel. So that's what I was told. Well, slightly different. I learned later that he had a sister, Dory. He never told us about Dory until later. I'll explain about that later. But the really weird thing to me, interesting thing, was when I looked at his naturalization papers, it said when he came, which 18 December 1920, which was kind of what I expected. But he came under the name Joe Frankel. Frankel? I knew he had the name Joe Garfinkel from his mother's maiden name. He was born Joe Rottenstrike from his father's name, but Joe Frankel? Who the hell is Frankel? And I looked up the ship. That the name of the ship was also on the naturalization documents, and sure enough, it was Eva, Joe, and Dora Frankel. Wow. Then I learned way after that. Well, not way after that, but I learned from my mother after my father died that guess what? Your father had been married and divorced before he met me. That's also was shocking to me. These are two shocking things I learned. Well, my mother, Rose, and Joe met at Loch Sheldrake, that's in the Catskills, Loch Sheldrake Hotel, also known as Han's Hotel. Han was the owner. I can have a lot of nice story about how they met, but I think for the sake of time, I won't tell it. I love the story though. And they got married in April of 1940. And he became a citizen in 1942. He died in December 1978, and I was at the funeral. Okay, so let's go on here now. Now look at these mysteries or things I want to know. The first one, well, I know that now. He came in December of 1920, but now I have two more mysteries. Whom did he marry before he met my mother? And whom did he marry and divorce, and when? When did he marry? When did he divorce? I don't know. I have no idea. And then, where did Franco come from? I have no idea about that either. Well, I do now, but I didn't at that time. So this Franco thing must involve my grandmother. So I started looking at my grandmother's history. Okay, she was born in Galicia, but probably in Bucha. Oh, by the way, what's Galicia? Galicia was a province of Austria at the time, and it really is currently, that area currently is partly in Poland, partly in Ukraine. So it's where Poland and Ukraine come together nowadays. Okay, she got married in 1904. She had 3 children. The birthdays of the 3 children that she wrote down in her naturalization papers. The first child, Dora, she says 6 August birthday, but Dora in her paper says it was 27 August. Someone else, but for my father, she says he was born on December 3rd in 1907, but he's always said he's born on July 12th. And his papers say that, and he always told us that, so who knows? But the really weird thing, again, in her papers, my grandmother, is that she said she was divorced in 1910. He told us they got divorced after World War I. So 1910, my father was 3 years old, or maybe even less than that, depending when the divorce was. And moreover, that she came to New York City in 1912. My father was 5 years old. He never told us that. So in 1920, he came with his mother and his sister to this country. So between 1910 or 1912 and 1920, my grandmother wasn't in the picture at all. So my grandfather was a single parent for at least 8 years, maybe longer. So I was a single parent later on for about 8 years also. So I didn't realize I was doing, family things. Okay. Then another thing I learned is that Eva's parents, Selah Garfinkel and Hannah Frankel, died in Buchach in June of 1919. Notice I have 3 references here, 3 sources, and it uses my Yiddish name, and also uses the Genealogical Society. They're both involved in this. So I'll go into that a little more, how I learned about Eva's parents. So, you know, I mentioned that I visited Buchach, which is in Austria, not Austria, Ukraine now. And it was a little over a week-long tour from one of the local synagogues. And then my daughter Sarah and I took a side trip to Buchach. And then it turns out that the International Jewish Genealogical Society was meeting in Warsaw just after. So I signed up to go there. And I wasn't the only person from the Greater Washington Society to sign up. So Myra Tack, who is one of the more experienced members of the society, hosted a luncheon to sort of get us all coordinated. And when we go over there, you know, we'll take pictures, we'll do this, we'll do that, etc. So we had a nice luncheon at her house. And can you people see this, by the way? I can't see because I'll turn this off. Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
And then moreover, as the luncheon went on, they said, okay, all you newcomers, if you want some help, since we have a lot of experienced people at this luncheon, we'll give you some help. I said, oh, sure, I'm a newcomer, I need help. So Shelley Polero, who actually at the time was the membership chair, I think, of the Jewish Gen organization, I believe it was. She said, okay, Jerry, just give me a name and a town and I'll show you what Jewish Gen can show you. Well, usually I always say Buchach. I usually say Rottenstrike because I know my grandfather's name was Rottenstrike. This time I said Garfinkel and Buchach. So we entered that in, and this is what I came out to. Can you see my
Yes,
spot here?
we can see your cursor moving.
So it said Hannah Frankel died in June of 1919, June 9th. She was from Buchach. Also doesn't say, I left it off here, but she died of typhus. Why in the world am I getting that? Then I looked further and I said, oh, her husband was Selig Garfunkel, also from Buchach. Well, maybe that's something about. So I looked up Selig Garfunkel and it said he also died in June of 1919, about a week later. He had no spouse because his spouse had died. That's interesting, really interesting. Another interesting thing is that it said they're both single. Well, how can they be single if he's the spouse? You know, it's kind of a little weird in itself. But then I realized that in the Jewish community of Galicia, when people married, they usually did not marry civilly. They only married Jewishly. Various reasons, one of which is large tax. There's other reasons that unless they needed to get official papers that they were married, they would just marry Jewishly. That's why, in terms of the government, they're still single, even though they knew they were really married. Okay, but how does this relate to me now? Well, then I realized my name is Zelig Shepsel. My parents said I was named after their grandfathers. Well, I knew that Shepsel Aronowitz was my mother's grandfather, also Marsha's father's grandfather. So the Shepsel part came from my mother's side, but the Zelig part must have come from my father's side. Well, Zelig is really Yiddish for Selig. Selig is a German word for blessed. So this person named Selig, I was probably named after. So he was probably my father's grandfather. He was my grandmother's father. So he was Eve's father. Well, then this must have been Eve's mother. So I figured out now that Eve's mother's maiden name was Frankel. Spelled slightly different, but the spelling doesn't really matter. So I learned now where Frankel comes from. So now I know that Frankel comes from Eva's mother's maiden name. Okay, I learned. Okay, now let's go on and talk more about my grandmother. You know, it's very strange. You know, she did all this stuff. She came to the United States she got divorced, and then she came early by herself and all this kind of stuff. And came back and took her daughter and one son. So I'm thinking, what's with her? So here's what I think happened. I think she came from a fairly well-to-do family. Why do I think that? Well, she came in 1912 by herself, but the ticket she had, that's on in the manifest, was second class. Well, second class is not first class, but it's second class, still pretty high up. It's fairly expensive. Most of our ancestors who came in steerage or fourth class, you know, a fairly inexpensive way. She did a more expensive way. And then later on, she came back to Europe, and she came back to the States with 2 children. She's obviously paid for all that, so there must have been money involved. And in the olden days, a rich Jewish family would often marry their daughters to a young scholar, a young rabbi. And that's probably what happened, because they were both fairly young. My grandfather was, I think, 17 or something, and she was 19, something like that. They were pretty young. So I think that's what happened. And why did she come back to Europe afterwards? Well, her parents, we know now, died in June of 1919. So she probably heard about it at some point, and she may have to come back to the, you know, tombstone, or maybe claim the inheritance or something, probably involving her parents dying in June of 1919. That's my conjecture. I have no evidence about that. Okay, so now let's talk about my aunt, my father's sister. She was also born in Buchat. She was the oldest child, born in 1905. She was a Hebrew teacher. Well, that I learned because the census has that in there. But I was trying to figure out, you know, something about her. My father said that she married a member of the New York Assembly. That's the state government in New York, that lower house. Well, so what I did was I did a lot of research, Wikipedia, and something called the Political Graveyard, which had members of long ago governments, and the wiki of the New York State Legislature, members for different years, so it wasn't complete, and something called Our Campaign, all kinds of things, trying to figure out whom she married. I also looked up, I looked up marriage listing, and it had Dora Garfinkel or Doris Garfinkel marrying various people in the 30s, but I don't know which person it was. So I had to look all this stuff up. And eventually I found out that Gabriel Slovak was not a member of the assembly, but he was a candidate for the assembly way after that time period, but for three periods in a row, 46, 48, 52, two-year terms. And he ran his Liberal Party. He didn't do too well. He got 4% of the vote, but he was an official candidate. So I thought, well, maybe he was also a member at some point, you know, maybe years before I looked up, years after I looked up. So usually I use Google, but this time I have Bing. So I said to Bing, was Gabriel Slovak a member of the New York State Assembly? And right away it gave me the response, yes, Gabriel Slovak was a member of the New York State Assembly, representing the 121st District in 1993 to 2002. Wow, great. Then I looked up in my more, nominal things. Was he really there? No, it wasn't there at all. Remember now, Bing is now using AI. AI tells you, gives you answers to things. It may not be the correct answer, but it gives you an answer you might like. So give me an answer I like, but it's completely false. Okay, go back to my aunt. My father told us, Sheila and me, that she fell down the stairs and maybe her husband pushed her, I don't know, and that she had a miscarriage. He didn't say when, and that baby obviously died miscarriage, and they got divorced shortly afterwards. Well, when did all this happen? Well, I looked up find a grave and looked up her name. Her married name was now Dora or Doris Slovak, and it didn't have, well, it had baby of Doris Slovak died on 31 March. So that's probably, she may have fell downstairs maybe a day before, I don't know, but it's around that time period. So to find a grave was very useful. And he also told us that she was hospitalized, but she had nervous breakdown. She was hospitalized in Bellevue. Okay. And through the census, I discovered that Doris Slovak was actually in Middletown in 1940, in Middletown Hospital. Well, people on this program may not know, but Bellevue was known as, among other things, where they had mental health situations. They tried to bring people back who had nervous breakdowns or other mental problems. And then later on, some of the people were transferred to another mental health facility in Middletown. Now, this makes me feel a bit guilty because when we were little kids, and Sheila may remember, if you had a fight with someone, another little kid said, "Oh, you belong in Bellevue, you're crazy." And then later on, we learned about Middletown, since we were upstate. Middletown was fairly close to us. "Oh, you belong in Middletown." Now, I didn't do that very much. I was pretty much of a goody-goody, but I did it once in a while, and other people did a lot. And I had no idea that Bellevue, Middletown, was where my own aunt was institutionalized. Really weird to me. He never told us when we were little kids that he had a sister, probably because she was institutionalized. But in the mid-50s or sometime in the 1950s, I'm not sure when, neither Sheila nor I remember exactly when it was, my grandmother took her to visit us. We had a hotel in the Catskills, since during the off season, we were at the hotels, nobody else was there except us. And she took her daughter, Dora, or Doris, as she was called then, to see if she can sort of exist, operate outside the institution. At this point, around 1955, she had been institutionalized for 20 years. So she took her there, and then my parents had to say who this person was who was going to visit us. That's how we found out we had an Aunt Dora. And then she died in 1984 in November. I got that from death notice. And what I've been doing the last year or two since I discovered this, took me years and years to find this out. I've actually been saying Kaddish for her, and sometime in November, I don't know exactly when it was she died, because she obviously had no living children. Okay, let's go back to my grandfather, whom I never met, Tzvi Tovia, and he spells it Tovia in Fiddler on the Roof. Tovia is spelled Tovya, but he spells it IA. And the reason I know that is that, I can't do this. I'm going to take this screen, where am I still? Okay. I'm stopping the screen share. I want to show you, this is my grandfather's book. And there's his name, if you can't see it, but his name's over there. So I have all that stuff. Go back to screen sharing. Okay, and you can. Oh, hopefully you can see it. You still see it, Marsha? You see it?
Yes.
Okay. So he was born in Buchach, etc., etc. But a lot of my, about that I knew from my grandmother's naturalization paper. But from his book, and that's just, I consider a non-standard source. Nobody says your grandfather's book is one of your sources. I found out about lots of things about his family, because when he wrote this book, which is a religious book, you have to say in the beginning what your bona fides are. So they had various top rabbis saying he's a good guy. Like, I think Rabbi Cook was one of them. He was the chief rabbi of Palestine at the time, before Israel was a state. And he talked about his family. So I got a lot of family stuff, and my daughter, Rebecca, actually translated it for me. So I got his father's name and his mother's name, and that his mother's great-grandfather was a big shot rabbi, Chacham Tzvi. He had been the rabbi for a while of Amsterdam, Netherlands, and he was a big crusader, bad word, a big fighter against the false messiahs at the time, a very famous rabbi. And that my grandfather made Aliyah in March of 1921. I got that from well, not from the Jewish Genealogical Society, but the Israel equivalent of that, Israel Genealogical Research Association. And they quoted the Israel Archives. I spelled it wrong, it's be archives, not archiver. And in the book, he talks about his new wife, which we hadn't known until we looked at what the book said, that he had a wife named Arizal Nechama Baba, and the two of them had a son, Ben Zion, or Ben Zion HaKohen. Well, HaKohen, we're all HaKohens, we're all priestly, hereditary priest, HaKohen. And his wife's father's name was Eliezer Alta, and his wife had a son and daughter, which is stepson and stepdaughter. So she was married earlier. In those days, you didn't have children when you weren't married. And I'm assuming that she was a widow. She could have been divorcee, but more likely a widow. It could be a divorcee. And the wife's brother, Ben Zion Samuel, and Arya Lev Berka. Okay, very good. But then going back now to the Jewish Genealogical Society of Greater Washington, they have a newsletter that comes out, I think, once a week. And they talk, well, not once a month, I think. And they talk about various things that in the news about Jewish genealogy. And Sheila Wexler, Sheila's the president. I'm not sure she may write the newsletter. She distributes it, certainly. Says that MyHeritage, which is one of the big DNA organizations, it's actually an Israeli company, and Billion Graves together just did a digitization of all the Israeli graves. Oh, so I can look up my grandfather, see when he died in Billion Graves. I did that, found nothing. But then my daughter Sarah, who lives in Israel, looked up my grandfather in Billion Graves in Hebrew, and she found a lot. So, in particular, that my grandfather died on 27 March 1970. I'll talk a little more about that later. But that his wife, Nechama, her death, well, first of all, she was born near Lublin in Poland. Her father's name is Yehuda Arya Gieleman. She married Tzvi Tovia in 1944, and she died in the War of Independence of Shrapnel in Jerusalem 2 months after the war began. And she's considered a martyr of Israel because she died in the war. Well, now all this stuff is really, really interesting and a bit weird. I had no idea that my grandfather's wife was considered a martyr of Israel. There's a plaque for her on Mount Herzl where the heroes of Israel are buried, or at least they talk about them there. She's not really buried there, but there's a plaque about her over there. And the other interesting thing is her father's Yehuda Arya Gieleman. Wow. her father's name in the book, let's go back. In the book, her father's name is Eliezer Alta. On the plaque, her father's name is Yehuda Arya Gellerman. Could she have two fathers? Possibly. Not in the way we have two fathers nowadays, but it could be a father and stepfather, like Marshall could talk about that my grandmother, Annie, had two mothers, as mother and stepmother. Possible. But I'm conjecturing that Yehuda Arya Gellerman was not her father, but her first husband. Because remember now, when people die in Israel, Jewish people or Muslim people, they're buried right away. And the information for the graveyard and for, various things about departed people come from usually the spouse. But the spouse just lost their own spouse, and they're not really, very calm. They often give inaccurate information. So I conjecture that either my grandfather gave the name Yehuda Arya as her father, or maybe he actually said that was her first husband's name and the father of her first two children, and the people who are recording it recorded it wrong. But in any case, that's what I conjecture. Another evidence for that is, could her father's name be Yehuda Arya? I don't think so, because remember, her brother was Aryeh Lev. Would her father give his son's name same as his? Ashkenazi Jews don't do that. So I strongly suspect this is not her father, and it's probably her brother. The plaque, by the way, here's all the stuff about the plaque, and it tells about how she died, and that the Jordanians were shelling civilian areas of Jerusalem, and she died that way. But also that she married in 1944. And remember that in my grandfather's book, he mentions his wife Nechama. The book came out in 1940. So maybe he did, could be a different Nechama. Maybe it's two Nechamas, possible. But also another possibility is that he may have kept the tradition in Galicia where they get married only Jewishly, not civilly. And then in 1944, when the war was going on, World War II, and maybe they felt that it's good to be recognized officially as married, they may have officially got married. That's possible. I've been told that mostly in Jerusalem, in Palestine and Israel, they did not keep this tradition of only marrying Jewishly, but maybe he did. Who knows? Okay, so that's my conjecture. And here's from Buchach. Let me talk a little bit about Buchach. Okay, so this is my grandfather. He was born in 1887. I don't know exactly when. He died in 27 March 1970. The most famous person from Buchach is Agnon. He's the only Israeli who ever won the Nobel Prize in Literature. He was also born 1887 in Buchach. He also died in Jerusalem in 1970. And he wasn't a chassid like my grandfather was a Hasidic rabbi, but he was very close to the Hasidim. So did they know each other? Well, I contacted Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs. He is the world expert on Agnon. He runs something called Agnon House, and he's translated a lot of Agnon's books into English, and he does a lot of stuff with Agnon. He couldn't find any record of my grandfather in Agnon's papers, but he agrees with me that they probably were at least friends. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about my other grandfather, Annie's husband, my mother's father. He was born, 1878, maybe. People talk about being born again. Well, these are official records of when he was born. And he was born again and again and again and again. He was born again 4 times. It looks like he had different birth years. Interesting fellow. And some of the information comes from something called the Karelitz family tree. Notice the Karelitz, K-A-R-E-L-I-T-Z. He doesn't have the E in his last name. And this was found by my cousin Gary's son, Toby. I found it later myself. And it's very interesting, that family tree. And it was developed by Seth Kozlowski. And in there, everybody has a letter and number. So my grandfather was C43. So his children would be C43 something. C431 for his first child, Helen. C432 for his second child, Rose. Since I'm Rose's first child, I'm C431. And in the family tree, there's a picture of Helen and Rose when they were little kids, 2 or 3 years old. Earliest picture I have of my mother. And also going back, this picture of my grandfather and grandmother at their wedding was also in the online thing. Most famous person in there is the Chazan Ish, and he was he was head of the he wasn't a chassid, but he was a Haredi, very orthodox, ultra orthodox. He was the head of the ultra orthodox in Palestine when the state was started, and he was very famous. Even more famous than the Chazan Cham. And I used to think that he was the one who negotiated with Ben Gurion to allow the yeshiva boys to not go in the army. But I've learned now that that's not exactly the case. There was a very well publicized incident where Ben Gurion went to visit the Chazan Ish, and they did discuss the issue of the yeshiva boys not going into the army. But at that point, this in the early 1950s, it was already established that the yeshiva boys were not going in the army. But Ben Gurion was trying to see whether that could be changed, things of that sort. And also the question was whether the religious girls should either go in the army or have national services and that sort. But they had a big discussion about that, but that wasn't really where it was decided. But they still had a big discussion about that. And his nephew, the son of his sister, Chaim Kanievsky, became a big rabbi, not as big as Chazan Ish, became a big rabbi in Israel, just died about a year ago. So he was my third cousin, and 500,000 people came to his funeral. So that was a big thing. I also discovered that Leonard Karlitz is there. He's not as famous as these guys, but he was a mathematician at Duke. And when I was in the mathematics business, I was a faculty member, math department at University of Illinois. I often would see the Duke Math Journal, and in it, almost always there'd be 1 or 2 articles by Leonard Karlitz. Well, Karlitz sounds like my mother's maiden name, Karlitz, but he spells with a C, she spells with a K. Well, it turns out he is a cousin, far apart. So here's what I know now about my family and stuff. I know a lot more than I did before. And these are my sources. And but I didn't have a book about my uncle Isaac, but I did find some stuff about his burial and stuff. But a lot of it is wrong. It said he was born in Poland. He was born in Galicia, not in Poland. At that point, Galicia was not in Poland, and that he immigrated in 1914, which is false. He immigrated in 1921. He was 67, not 69. So a lot of mistakes. Okay, that's all I'm going to say, and I'll turn it over to my cousin Marsha. Let me stop the screen so I can do the other one instead. Let me see if I can find it now. Get out of this. Get out. I don't want that. Okay. Now, okay. Out. And I'll go into this. Okay. And I'll go into slideshow. And I'll do a, oh, come on. What's happening now? Why can't I? Check here. Why can't I do screen saves? Do this here. Excuse me, I'm trying to get the other one to be screen shared. Okay. Let's see if we can do this. I think I need help, Mary Jane. I don't know why I can't share screen on that one. Oh, it is.
So you clicked your share screen button.
Well, I can't get it. I can't get to the button. The problem is when I put the slideshow on.
You put it on before and it was fine. Don't put the slideshow on before you click the screen share.
Last time I had to, I thought, okay, I'll try that. I'll try that. Okay. Yeah, you see this thing now?
No, we're not seeing you sharing screen.
Oh, I have to press the button. Okay.
There you go.
Okay.
There you are. Now you can go to slideshow.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Mary Jane.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now you have to tell me, Marcia, when
I will tell you. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Gerald's cousin, Marcia.
Hold on a minute, Marcia. We're not seeing the full screen. Jerry, you need to go back and hit slideshow again and start from the beginning.
Okay.
The slideshow didn't start.
Okay.
Okay.
You see it now?
It doesn't look like the slideshow. It looks like something, but I'm not sure what.
Okay, let's try it again.
Yeah,
It is
turn
the
off
first-
the slideshow on your computer before you start sharing your screen.
It is the first slide of the slideshow.
Yeah, so turn off the slideshow and go back to.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. It's kind of hard to do for some reason. I keep pressing the button and it doesn't want to do it. Okay. Okay.
All right, now share your screen.
What do I have two of them here? Maybe I'm the
It's
wrong
not.
one. Marsha's slideshows. Let's see if what's the right one.
We're not getting a screen share. Okay, now your screen share. Okay, so the screen that's up has the slides in the middle and the list of slides down the sides.
Yeah,
So you want to go to slideshow.
Yeah, now I can do the slideshow, but
Yes, and start, well, you can start from the beginning or whichever one you want.
you still see the first slide now?
First slide, nothing's changed. The slideshow has not become full screen.
Oh, okay. So I had the wrong.
So
slide.
don't go from this slide. Say start from the beginning.
No,
Go to slideshow.
This is for some reason I have two copies there. I don't know why. There's two copies. I have no idea why. Okay. Okay, let me get rid of this one now. Oops, what happened?
Nothing.
I lost everything. All right. Let's see what we have here now. Okay. Okay, I think maybe, okay, let's try this one out. All right. Now you see the PowerPoint.
Go to start from beginning to the left. It's not going into slideshow from start from current slide. So try going from the beginning.
It is going into that, but you know,
It's not in slideshow mode. All we're seeing is.
I understand, but I don't know why it's doing that. We may have to go.
Just go.
Oh, let me stop share. Okay. When I go into slide, there's 2 copies. Why am I 2 copies? Let's try this copy then.
Does this work before?
I know it worked before. That's why it's so surprising.
All right. So go to slideshow up on the top.
Let's see if this works now.
Select that and then go farther to not go from current slide. Go there. Is any, yes. It's not great, but it's better than it was. I don't know what you're.
You see,
at least we only have one slide.
Okay, you have the slide. It should show.
Try advancing a slide. Let's see what happens.
Also, now at least we could read it.
Okay. Okay, Marcia.
Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. I am Gerald's cousin, Marcia. My grandmother and Gerald's grandmother were sisters. So the first slide here shows you the Aronowitz family as far back as I've been able to trace it, with Shepsel Aronowitz, whose photo you saw at the beginning of our presentation, and his wife, Hasha or Hashka Becker or Baker. They had 4 children together. My grandmother, Ida Aronowitz, was the eldest. Her brother, Chaim or Jaime, was second. And he was followed by twins, one of whom was Gerald's grandmother, Annie, and her sister, Jenny. My grandmother, Ida, hold on for a second. My grandmother, Ida, whose name originally was Haya Fega, and most of my relatives refer to her as Fega. She was born in 1881 in Korachin, which was part of Grodno. And it's currently part of Poland. It's near Białystok. Again, the eldest daughter of Hasha, or Helen in English, Becker or Baker, and Shepsel Aronowitz. She helped raise her younger siblings, as I said, Hyman, who was 4 years younger, and the twins, Annie and Jenny, who I was told always were 6 years younger, but when I started doing the math, it was really 7.5 years younger. And she helped her father in his bakery shop, and I remember her as being a wonderful baker. Her mother died in childbirth when her mother was age 32, and she was 12. Her father remarried a young woman whom the children did not like. This much we got from my mother, who recorded a conversation that she had with my grandmother. Fortunately, it was really the only thing we had to go on. You can do the next slide, Jerry, please. Ida emigrated to the US at age 18, arriving in Philadelphia on December 13th, 1899, on the ship Belgenland, leaving from Bremen and stopping in Liverpool. I would never have known this if it weren't for a surprise email I got several years ago, excuse me, from a woman named Maria Crane, who was trying to trace the family tree of the Feingold family. I did know from the conversation that my mother recorded that my grandmother was sponsored by a cousin, but that's really all I knew. Maria Crane was looking for Annie Aronowitz, but I knew that Annie hadn't come early enough for her to have been sponsored by Harry Feingold in 1899 when my grandmother came. It turns out that my grandmother may have originally taken the name Annie. And what I realized is that all of them sort of decided on English names that didn't necessarily reflect on what their original Hebrew or Jewish or Russified names were. But in 1900, Annie Aronowitz was listed as living with the family of Harry Feingold. My grandmother was sponsored by Harry Feingold through something called the Rosenbaum Bank. And Harry Feingold paid $34 for her passage in steerage from Europe, and the boat landed in Philadelphia. I would never have known to look anywhere else except for New York if it weren't for this researcher who was actually researching somebody else. But sure enough, Temple University had a pretty extensive file on Jewish immigration through Philadelphia, and this researcher found this information. In the 1900 census, as I mentioned, she was living with Harry and his family, not in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, where she originally lived with them. And actually, so the slide that you see is the entry in the Rosenbaum Bank. And apparently there were 2 or 3 banks that were set up for the passage of Jewish people from Russia to the United States. And although it's very small print here, if you enlarged it, you would see that my grandmother was sponsored by Harry Feingold, and he paid $34 to bring her to the United States. So you can do the next slide, Jerry.
Wait, I see what it says Annie Aronowitz. No, so that says daughter of Shepsel Aronowitz. Okay.
Yes, the daughter of Shepsel. Not on this, but on the 1900 census, which I think I included here, you will see that she's listed as Annie Aronowitz, but your grandmother didn't come until much later.
Right.
So she came originally, and that's part of her immigration papers. You can do the next slide. This is where she lived originally. The building is still standing, and it is 187 Bridge Lane in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. And the building is still there, which made me really excited. In 1900, going through census records, I discovered that she was still living with the Feingolds on Hester Street, at 199 Hester Street on Manhattan's Lower East Side. You can go to the next slide. She married my grandfather, Michael Kaplan, on February 28th, 1904 in New York City. But before that, in 1902, her sister Jenny arrived. Jenny was one of the twins. She was the twin with Annie. And she was only 14 when she came by herself on the Kroonland, which sailed from Antwerp, Belgium. Jenny was sponsored by my grandmother and lived with my grandmother at 104 Hester Street. So she had moved from one place in Hester Street to the next, again on the Lower East Side. Being a former New Yorker, I was really interested in seeing all of the places in Manhattan that my grandmother and her siblings moved to from time to time. So after Jenny came in 1902, the next one, you can do the next slide. And I guess you can do the next slide after that. I think this was Chaim's, because the print is very small, it's hard for me to see, but I think that this is Chaim's or Jaime. So Ida's brother Jaime Kaplan, or Chaim Kaplan, was next, arriving on August 29th, 1904, on the same ship Kroonland that Aunt Jenny came on. And he too was sponsored by my grandmother and lived with my grandmother and her family. She had married Michael Kaplan in 1904. And at that time, they lived at 108 Murray Street. In the New York State 1905 census, they were living in Brooklyn at 511 Hopkinson Avenue. And my Uncle Jaime married Ida Clayman in 1911. And at that point, Uncle Jaime lived at 2169 Fifth Avenue, which was East Harlem. You can go to the next slide. And I guess I apologize that I didn't realize these were going to be so small. You can go to the next slide. So that's my grandparents' wedding certificate. And at that time, my grandmother lived at 136 Eldridge Street in 1904. You can go to the next slide. There's Hyman's and Ida's marriage certificate that show that he lived in East Harlem. What I wanted to show you, is it possible to go back, Jerry?
Yes.
So on my grandmother's marriage certificate, her mother is listed as Hashka Becker in the lower right-hand corner. And I'm telling you this for a reason. The next slide, please. Uncle Jaime's wedding certificate also lists his grandmother as Hasha Becker. Next slide, please. This is Aunt Annie, or Gerald's grandmother's wedding certificate. And curiously, she lists her mother as Hannah Stein. All these years, up until fairly recently, Gerald's family tree listed his great-grandmother as Hannah Stein, while I knew my great-grandmother as Hasha Becker. So this was one of our family mysteries. And Aunt Jenny's marriage certificate, which I think is also in this slideshow, but it doesn't matter, listed her mother as Hasha Becker. When Jerry and I finally looked at his grandmother's wedding certificate, what we finally surmised is that either she was listing her stepmother, which was kind of doubtful, or somebody screwed up. If you look at the marriage certificate, Samuel Carlitz's mother was listed as Jenny Stein. So perhaps somebody got confused. I don't think that this is Aunt Annie's handwriting. I don't think she would have had such a good handwriting, being a fairly recent immigrant. So maybe it was the person who was recording the marriage. We'll never know. But what we think happened is that it was a screw up, and that in fact our common great-grandmother's name was Hasha Becker.
Can there be an error on an official document?
An error on official, heaven forbid, right? Anyway, Aunt Annie didn't come until she was 18, and my grandmother also sponsored her. She came on the same Kroonland from Bremen. The 1910 census, and I guess you can go to the next slide. Let's see if that, okay, well, that's Aunt Jenny's, and you see the Hasha Becker there as well. You can go to the next slide. So this is a slide or photo taken probably right after Aunt Annie came. The 1910 US Census shows Aunt Annie, or your grandmother, Gerald, living with my grandmother and my grandfather at 104 Sutter Avenue in Brownsville. So by that point, they had lived at a number of Brownsville addresses. And she married Samuel Carlitz when she was 23. I'm so charmed by this picture. It's one of my favorites, and I have quite a few old pictures. But one of the reasons I love this picture is that Aunt Jenny is on the right, Aunt Annie, or your grandmother, is on the left. Aunt Jenny reminds me so much of our cousin Barbara, who died when she was 41. very tragically. And your grandmother on the left reminds me of Madeline.
Yes.
And so, you know, the family resemblance lives on. I think that's so sweet. You can do the next slide. This one you've seen already. This is your grandmother, my Aunt Annie's wedding picture. I wish there was a wedding picture that survived of my grandmother, but I don't have any pictures of her at all. The next picture is of the twins well after they were married with their children. So Aunt Jenny is on the left with her husband, Burl Trushansky, and your grandmother, Aunt Annie, is on the right with Samuel Karlitz. I imagine that the children on the right are Helen and maybe your mother, and Tess, probably.
No,
The two
probably
eldest.
neither. Who knows?
Next slide. This is one of our mysteries. So the mystery I mentioned earlier was who actually was our great-grandmother. And I think we're probably pretty convinced that she was Chasha Becker and not Hannah Stein. This is an Aronowitz family photo with somebody blocked out. We don't know who anybody in this photo is, but it is our Aronowitz family. I think on the left is my grandmother, Ida. But I don't know for sure. I think that the young man in the middle is our Uncle Jaime, but I don't know for sure. Why there was somebody blocked out? Maybe they didn't like the way they came out in the picture. Maybe they didn't like who was in the picture and they blocked it out. But this one will always be a mystery to me. So I think that's the end of my slide. You can go to the next one, but I'm pretty sure that's it. Yeah. That's my presentation.
Very good.
I guess I will mention that because this session was titled Two Non-Professional Researchers, I kind of got into this by accident when I got this amazing email from Maria Crane, and then got involved in Ancestry. Most of the information I got was through Ancestry records. I looked through Jewish Gen. I didn't really get any information. I posted my interest in finding anybody from Korochin, the place they came from, or anybody with the name Aronowitz, but I didn't get any responses. And I keep looking, hoping that something will pop up. I did get a match on Ancestry of someone with very close ties who had also listed Korochin, but she never really responded, which is such a frustration for people on Ancestry that most of the people you contact, you'll never hear from. But I keep plugging away, hoping that someday I will get something of value.
You notice on the marriage certificates, your grandmother and Uncle Jaime all put down that they were from Russia. But my grandmother and my grandfather both said they were from Grodno, Russia. That misled me because Grodno is a fairly big city on the border between now Belarus and Poland. So when I went to the International Convention in Warsaw, someone said, you know, there's also a tour to Belarus. I think, well, my grandparents were both from Grodno, I'll go to Belarus. But then by the time I got there, I realized that they probably were from the Grodno Gubernica, the Grodno state, which includes what do you call it?
Korochin.
The bagel city, what do you call it?
Białystok. Yeah.
Białystok.
Yeah.
And I think my grandfather was from what's now in Belarus. My grandmother was what's now in Poland, but it's around Grodno area. But I went to Belarus, I thought they were from Grodno.
Yeah. No. Right. Right.
Any questions, Mary Jane?
There are a couple of things that were brought up. You actually responded to a couple of the questions that were posted as your talk went on. Doris Shapiro says her first cousin's married name was Marcia Spector, but that first cousin has died, so probably not you.
Probably not me. Yeah,
Um,
I know of 2 or 3 other Marcia Spectors who I think are still alive. Yeah.
Mhm.
I searched for a husband that didn't have such a common Jewish name because I grew up as a Kaplan and I thought Spector wouldn't be as common, but sure enough, there are a lot of them.
Yeah. Okay. Jan says, if your grandfather was a Cohen, how could he marry a widow or a divorcee? And then Talia and Rebecca said, that's a good point. Maybe she was a widow. They think that's allowed. I don't know one way or the other.
Well, I mean, Jan is a rabbi. I'm not, but you're allowed to marry a widow. I'm pretty sure you are. Yeah, that's another reason that she probably wasn't a divorcee. Yeah, my grandfather would not have married a divorcee. That's,
Okay.
I'm glad, Jan, that you figured that out.
And I'm not sure which part of this is referring to, but someone said, sometimes in an Ashkenazi community, when someone has a life-threatening illness, the name is changed to trick the angel of death, and altar is added in the hopes the ill person would leave until he's an altar. So does that attach to something you were discussing?
Well, Eliezer Alta is the name in my grandfather's book of his wife's father. So Alta is actually a fairly common Jewish name. So I don't know.
So they may have had an illness as a child and survived and kept the altar.
Yeah, but Eliezer is very different from the names on the plaque. So
yeah,
that's a mystery.
So next one is, around the time Rabbi Kanievsky died, I heard he served in the IDF in the War of Independence, even though his father was opposed to Haredi boys going into, and I don't know this word, so I'll guess army. Do you know anything about that?
No, I had no idea that he served. It's very surprising. It's kind of reminds me of the Rebbe, you know, what do you call it, the Chabad rabbi, you know, in World War II. He was in the Brooklyn Navy Yard servicing the ships because he had a degree in nautical engineering. So who realized that these Haredi people served either in the army or
Yeah. Well, I guess if they thought they could be of use. Okay. And here's someone who wants to make a connection. My classmate at Shulamith School for Girls in Borough Park, Brooklyn, was Phyllis Aronowitz. Her father was a dentist. Any family ties?
Not that I
No. Aronowitz, meaning son of Aaron, is also a fairly common name too, but it's worth a try. It's always worth asking.
Yeah, well, also going with this Cohen business, my mother had, well, the name Garfinkel is typically a leading name, not a Cohen name. But my mother thought that her father and mother both came from Cohen families. And Aronowitz, son of Aaron, maybe that's a Cohen thing because, you know, Aaron was the first Cohen. But her father, Sam Collitz, was definitely not a Kohen. He was a Levite because I want to show the picture again, but you know, he and the Chazan Ish have the same paternal ancestors. Chazan Ish was not a Cohen. I think he was a Levite. So therefore, my grandfather was probably a Levite.
That's all I have for questions. Anybody? I don't see any hands up on the participants list either.
Let me make one more remark related also to last week's talk by Jennifer Mendelssohn on the DNA stuff. The Family Tree DNA company allows you to see whether you have the Cohen gene. There's a gene that most Kohanim have, and I have that. I did that test because the company is basically a Jewish company. But
Is that on the autosomal test or on the Y-DNA?
the Y test.
On the Y test. Okay, so male line only. You have to have a string of males to take
Yeah,
the
well, I
test.
mean, the Cohen gene
Yeah.
is on the Y chromosome.
Okay,
And let me thank again my daughter Rebecca, who did a lot of translations. She's on.
okay, here's someone, people are still typing. Any explanation for the difference on being named Cohen or Ha-Cohen?
Well, Ha Cohen just means the Cohen. So people's last name would usually just be
Yeah.
Cohen, but someone's name, like my grandfather's, his name really was Tzvi Tovia, the Cohen. So Tzvi Tovia Ha Cohen. When you're called up for the Torah, they will say so and so the Cohen, Ha Cohen.
Okay, and Elizabeth wants to know if you have suggestions for genealogical traveling.
Well, I mean, I did go visit my father's shtetl, but I learned more in the preparation for going there than I was over there. I don't have any real information about.
Yeah, my only suggestions from my travels, especially if there's any chance that I'm going to run into a cousin or find a document, is to have a camera and a portable scanner or a scanning app on your phone. Because the worst thing is getting there and the cousin says, oh, I have some really nice pictures you would like to see, or there's a tombstone of somebody you weren't expecting and you need to be able to have that so you can take the information home.
And I
Okay.
would add to that Google Translate so that you can translate documents in another language or another alphabet.
Yes, and someone else wants to know how much research can you do at Ellis Island? I was just at Ellis Island a couple of weeks ago, actually. And they do have people there that will help you to find information in their records. But you don't need to go there to do a lot of it. You can do it online. And I would recommend stevemorse.org. His algorithm for searching Ellis Island immigration records is actually better for Jewish names than the records, the algorithm that they use at Ellis Island. So I would start with stevemorse.org. It's really interesting to go to Ellis Island, to walk and be in the room and so on. But for if what you're talking about on research is their immigration records, the manifests, you can get most of it online, and stevemorse.org will point you in the right direction.
Besides,
Mindy has her hand up.
Mary Jane also, remember that a lot of our grandparents didn't come to Ellis Island.
Exactly, but the question was specifically about Ellis Island. So
Right, but
that's what they have at Ellis Island, is the manifest for Ellis Island, Castle Garden, and the New York ports, what's available. If your family, like my family, came to Philadelphia, you can't do much research at all at Ellis Island. It's just interesting.
when I began,
So Mindy has her hand up. Mindy, if you want to unmute yourself. Mindy, anything? All right, there's another question here. Does anyone know how to get info from Chechnya? My grandparents came from Porlitz, Austria, which I'm being told is now in Chechnya. I have no experience with that.
Isn't Chechnya now in Russia?
Yes, it is. Mm.
Okay. Oh, Mindy typed her question. How far back do the ties to being a Kohen go?
Well, Aaron was like
Any
3,000 years.
religious experts here? No luck.
Well, some, I mean, talking not about that, but some people named Cohen are not really Kohanim.
Are not Kohen.
And,
yeah.
and some people whose name, you know, Katz is another name for Kohanim. Your name might not have a Cohen name, you still could be a Cohen. So that's why DNA is really much better. And by the way, another thing about talking about travel, when I was in Richmond, one of the young men in my synagogue had gone back to Europe with his wife to visit graveyards of his ancestors, and he discovered that his grandfather's graveyard had this on it, which is what shows you you're a Cohen. So he came back as a Cohen. He wasn't when he was Cohen when he left. So travel can change your life.
Yep. Definitely can. Okay. Just going back through the chat again to make sure. Someone is suggesting, and I'm sorry, I don't know who this connects to. Did she remarry a Stein? I think that might have been the one where you thought the grandmothers were listed as both grandmothers with the same name.
Mm-hmm.
The marriage records in New York City are interesting, but not definitive. My grandparents and on my grandfather's marriage document in New York City listed his parents' names as American names. His parents died, never came to this country.
Right.
And so it's interesting, but I'm not saying that was their name because they did not have American names. My grandmother, who was Kaya and Ida for her entire life that I or my mother knew, on her marriage record called herself Lillian.
Mm-hmm.
And my birth record, it has her father listed as Charles Carlitz.
Yeah. So a marriage record with a parent's name isn't any more definitive than a census record, because as you said in your talk, you don't know who the informant was, and it wasn't that person who wrote it down. So
Right.
It's interesting and it may lead you somewhere, but it is not the definitive answer.
Yeah, at one point in my own records, I was keeping myself, I put down high confidence, low confidence, middle confidence.
Mm-hmm.
I have high confidence in an official document where clearly the official themselves knew about it. Like, for example, the manifest of a ship. When it says it came in 18 December 1920, I believe it.
Yes.
The ship captain knows. Right. And the name of the person on the ship is usually pretty good because they do ask them. But like in my case, my grandmother was just using a maiden another name. I think the reason she may have used the name Franco was on her naturalization. She said she had never left the United States after she came in 1912. Well, she probably didn't want people to know that in 1919, 1920, she went back to Europe and came back. So I think that may be the reason why on the boat, whereas on the trip from Buchach to the port, they used the name Garfinkel.
Yeah.
And also that answers the other question. I think maybe Talia, somebody asked the question of why does my grandfather have all these different names, different birth years on this certificates? Well, people may want to think of being born a certain time. Like for example, if you're a man, you may want to be not eligible for the draft if you're too young or too old, that sort of. If you're getting married, a woman may want to appear younger than her husband because it's traditional for a woman to be younger. So there's various reasons why a person might tell their age differently. Another reason is that in the olden times, people weren't that careful about what their age was. Like, we have birthday parties. My Aunt Helen never had a birthday party until she was 99 years old. So 90 years old, in fact. But so they don't really know exactly when they were born.
But also, especially if they were coming from the Russian Empire, first of all, because they were Jewish, they were more likely to say, I was born on the third day of Hanukkah or something like that. Or they might know the Hebrew month and day, but not how that translated. And then to make it more complicated, the Russian Empire did not change to the Gregorian calendar until 1917. So they had all the dates that they used, even if they translated them correctly at the time, are off by a couple of weeks from the calendar that everybody else in the world uses. So the fact that they reported different birth dates, I mean, if you go through a lot of manifests, there are a lot of people who were born on the 4th of July or Christmas Day or something like that, because they really didn't know. I see Harold Kravis has his hand up. Do you want to unmute, Harold?
Thank you. I just wanted to tell you something. You guys are right, because I have marriage certificates of my grandmother's brothers and sisters, and they all put down, okay, their father, Chaim Skolnick, that was right. But they put their mother's maiden name differently.
Mm-hmm.
And then my grandmother puts down her mother's maiden name as Safer. So I figured I'll get her application, her Social Security application. She puts her mother as Goldie Friedman. So, and then I looked a couple months after that, I had her father's death certificate, and it has her mother's maiden name as Friedman. So I'm trying to get her brother's copy of his Social Security to see if he has Friedman. Then I know it's really Friedman, because one of her sisters had a different maiden name, but I forgot, Gorsher or Gasher, but because I didn't look at it right now. But anyways, on Ancestry, they have a copy of her Social Security. She put down Greenberg. So I kept changing my great-grandmother's maiden name, but now I put it Friedman for now.
Yeah. Well, I have the same thing. My great-grandmother's maiden name I have on each of her children's marriage certificate is different, and it's not even close.
Mhm.
So I'm guessing that they had no idea. They left the old country. They were separated from extended family in the old country. They had to put something, that's what they put. Barry was asking if anyone knows how to find details of people who emigrated to Israel during the Ottoman Empire. And Eli Savada suggests checking with the Israeli Genealogy Research Association, IGRA. They have the best kinds of documents on people who went to Israel before the state was founded.
Going back to the question of names, sometimes people actually change their name, like, Jared Kushner.
Mm-hmm.
His grandfather named Kushner, his grandfather was not born Kushner. His grandfather married someone named Kushner and then changed the name to that. When I was in Belarus, I sort of, where he had been.
Even in the old country, sometimes if a family only had girls and they were afraid that the name would die out, they would adopt a child from another family, and that boy would take the name of the family that was going to raise him but genetically, he's from a different family. Barry says that IGRA could not help him. So anybody have any other ideas on how to find people who went to Israel during the Ottoman Empire, who went there around 1905 and died in 1915?
Well, you know,
Maybe a
there's-
question for Jewish Jen?
Yeah, I would say, or Facebook, or, there's various
Yeah, so
genealogy.
the Jewish Gen Israel Research Division might have
Mhm.
something. I'm surprised that, IGRA couldn't help, but
Yeah, I don't know why, but they couldn't. And I wrote to the archives. I didn't actually get a response from them. So maybe they could help. The problem is I don't know exactly when he went. All I know is his name in English and Hebrew.
well, I know, I think it was Jerry that mentioned a bit ago about that they had recently announced that they had every gravestone in Israel. So
Yeah, I
did you
got
look
you
at
guys
that
that.
resource?
Yeah,
And
that
you
was
could
interesting.
find him that way and nail down some more information.
That was through Billion Graves, was that?
No, it wasn't Billion Graves.
It
I
was
think
being-
it was.
It was being Graves, but I couldn't find anything. My daughter found it using Hebrew.
In Billion Graves in Hebrew.
Being Graves.
In Hebrew.
But I thought that IGRA had a database, and maybe they put it in Billion Graves, but they were the ones who did the work.
No,
Yeah.
Mostly
well,
was what we got from the society, from the Greater Washington, JGSGW, that it was a combination of Being Graves and My Heritage.
Ah, okay,
My Heritage being the Israeli company.
right.
Right. I'm subscribed to them. I will try again. It's been one of my most frustrating searches.
And that was a fairly recent announcement that they had all those graves documented.
Okay. Well, I last tried about during the pandemic, so it was 2 or 3 years ago. I'll take these what you've been telling me. Thank you.
The Jewish Gen also now has a Sephardic research group, which would have more information on Ottoman Empire folks. So you might ask in their their little Facebook group or whatever they have for that research research group. But
Tracing
there's
the
Sephardic
Tracing the Tribe also has someone who's an expert on Sephardic genealogy.
Shelley Dardashti,
Yes. Mhm.
Shelley, whatever. I can
Right.
never remember how she says her name, but anyway, she
will.
is the expert on Sephardic, and she may have some thoughts. And she is in the Tracing the Tribe Facebook group, and I think she has also started one just for Sephardim. Let me look at something I just got in the mail.
This is the one who got me on.
So you guys keep going while I do that.
Very nice lady.
Hi, it's Rebecca, Jerry's daughter. I just wanted to say 2 things. One thing that I was always curious about was how my father's grandfather could be a chassid and want to go to Palestine, because I know there's a lot of people who are chassidim now who don't want to move to Israel because they consider it wrong to do that before the Messiah came. But in the book he wrote, he kept talking about a certain kind of chassid called the Chartkov chassid. And I did, honestly, just a little Google researching on them, and they turned out to be very, Zionist is sort of an odd word, but very land of Israel oriented. So I thought that kind of explains why going to Palestine, ancient Israel, was an option at the time. And the other thing, obviously, well, not obviously, but sort of the information my father found out about his father and how he was raised by his grandfather for so many years, and his mother had kind of left. Like, his grandmother was always sort of an interesting person to me, that she divorced so many years ago. She took back her maiden name, which is sort of very modern. She actually was married many times after that, which I forget if it was my aunt or my father that told me that. So yeah, it's sort of, you can do all the research, but you can't understand somebody's motivations for behaving the way they did.
I'm sorry.
No.
Thought you were done. I just posted a link in the chat to a recording that was done on the 2nd of April called Researching Jewish Ancestors in the Ottoman Empire by someone named David Mendoza. And that may give you something.
Is that the YouTube link? From
Yes,
Mary
I just
Jane Roth?
put it in the chat. It's a YouTube link.
Okay.
And
From Mary Jane Roth, that
that's
one?
the one, yes.
Thank you. I will copy that.
Mary Jane, could you
Yes.
please send me afterwards a copy of the chat?
When you click on the recording, the chat will be there as well.
Okay. Sometimes you can't record it.
Well, if you don't see it, but normally when you click on the recording, after I give you the link to the recording, when you click on the recording, the chat will be there as well.
You have to save it under the chat, in the bottom of the chat. Okay.
I automatically save the chats with the recordings.
No, I realize that when I do that same thing, but
Okay.
let me comment about Rebecca's stuff. I'm glad you said that my grandfather talked about the shadow sect. I was wondering whether he was part of that, because that's the city that's near Shtetl, that's near Buchach. The other thing is that not all Chazinim are anti-Zionist. Chabad is very Zionist, for example. They're strongly Zionist. You may not agree with their Zionist policy, but they're very strongly Zionist. So just because you're Hasidic or a Haredi doesn't mean you are anti or pro-Zionism. I'm sorry, Mary Jane.
Oh, that's, I'm just noticing that Mindy has her hand up.
Can you speak now, Mindy? You just mute yourself. You're also invisible.
I'm fully aware of the ridiculousness of trying to cover 500 years in 20 plus countries in 45 minutes. This will necessarily be a very rapid overview. What my goal is to remind people that there is information that we can see on the Ottoman Empire already. It's generally assumed as well.
Okay, so that's the beginning of the.
Sorry about that.
That I linked to.
Thank you. I'm
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I put that on.
Okay. Mindy typed in her question. How common was it for people who immigrated to the US from the old country to decide to go back? My experience is that it's not uncommon.
My grandmother, Annie, told me that she wanted to go back because she was expecting, the land full of milk and honey and stuff. And it wasn't until she met this handsome young man whom she eventually married. She wanted to go back. And even though Ida, or Faggy, as we called her, paid for Jenny and Jaime's ticket, Jaime, my understanding is, paid for Annie's ticket. And Jaime told Annie he'll pay a ticket for her to go back, but he won't pay a round trip ticket for her. Either she stays or she goes back, and that's it. but she actually was very unhappy when she first came here.
My great-grandfather's brother came over twice and went back twice. And unfortunately, when he tried to come again the third time, it was after 1924. They couldn't get visas and the whole family was wiped out. So not uncommon for people to decide to go back.
I wonder if anybody has heard what one person told me. I'd love to know if this is true, if others have heard about it. My great-grandmother came to the UK in 1881. Her daughter was born in Russian Poland in 1887 per the censuses. Obviously, they returned for that. And someone suggested to me that it was not uncommon to want to go back to the old country when you're having birth, to have your mother around you, etc., etc. Had anyone heard of that before? No.
Maybe it was more
that's
common
true.
from the UK because
It's closer.
it's at least sort of on the same continent.
Yeah,
It was a much bigger deal to go from the US.
yeah, yeah.
A colleague I knew in Richmond, all of his siblings were born in New York City, even though his parents lived in Richmond. They had to go back to New York to give birth.
Mhm. Okay.
They didn't trust the doctors in Richmond, basically.
Are you talking Richmond, Virginia, or Richmond, England?
Richmond, Virginia.
Oh, okay.
No.
Yeah, going from Richmond, England to New York would have been quite a trip.
Yeah.
Well, unless you're Ben Franklin, something he goes back. He gets to go
Yeah,
back.
he would go back and forth. Yes.
Ben Franklin arranged that he was never in the U.S. when one of his children was being born. He'd leave.
I think that really is the last question, Jerry, if you're.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me make one quick announcement. I guess I just said in the beginning. The only other class we have scheduled right now is at the end of the month on May 31st. We're going to have Rabbi Michael Strasfeld talk about his new book, also other things. He'll be interviewed by two people from Verbringen. I remember Michael Strasfeld was the editor or co-editor, I guess, of all 3 volumes of the Jewish catalog in the 1970s, which was a really big thing in the 1970s for the Jewish community. Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Mary Jane, again for helping organize this whole 3-session class and for doing all the Q&A and stuff. And by the way, for people who are still on, when I look at my copy of the chat, information from there I'll put on the email when I send out the email about where the recording for this session will be, so we get more information.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting.
Harold, you're waving your hand. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, I just want to have one more question. A couple of years, I forget how long it was. I went to a Jewish genealogy conference in Washington, D.C. Were you guys running that year? I
The
forgot.
JGSGW was running that. That would have been, it was just before I joined, so
Well, I was there.
15 years ago, maybe?
Okay, I was there at that one.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So the next one is in London in August.
I'm going to Israel for the first time.
Oh, well, you missed the conference that was in Israel a few years ago.
I know, but I'm going to Israel for the first time.
Okay, well, that'll be good.
Yep.
All right, thank you to everyone. If there are no more questions,
Bye-bye, everyone.
all right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.